Okay, so good evening. Welcome to Gary and to Erin. Um, and tonight, Gary, um, let me start by kind of introducing you a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you really to introduce yourself. You are a poet, a writer. You have cosmic connections with intergalactic beings.
Yeah,
Am
that's
I
true.
am I exaggerating or am I
No,
okay?
that's good. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are just a wonderful, creative, open-hearted human being. And so we're honored to have you here tonight to talk a little about intimacy and to talk in particular maybe about some of your experiences with caribou, dinosaurs, whatever you kind of feel like you'd like to bring into the conversation.
Thank you. Well, since in our correspondence back and forth, you seemed quite interested in my mentor, Nanao Sakaki, the wandering Japanese poet. I thought I would begin by saying I'm originally a Maine kid, and I went to Colby. And when I graduated from Colby, instead of going to graduate school, I wrote to my favorite poet at the time, who was Gary Snyder, and said, can I come live at your house and be your apprentice instead of going to graduate school? Because I was interested in the poetry that he was interested in that came out of the heart of the natural world. And I was interested in Zen Buddhism and Native American myth and legend and all these things that he seemed to already know a lot about. So I ended up hitchhiking from Maine to California and going to live at Gary's. And while I was there, one of his great mentors from Japan, the wandering poet Nanao Sakaki, showed up. And so I got to spend some time with Nanao and thought, here's someone I really want to wander around with. And so out of that came a great friendship with Nanao Sakaki, and Nanao came to Maine a number of times. But Nanao also he wandered the earth, and he didn't have a job or a house or a car or any of that stuff, but he would contact different friends when he had an idea in mind of something he would like to do. So at one point he was in the Mexican desert with Peter Wohl, and came back to Tucson with Peter and called up Beth and I, my wife Beth and I, here in Maine, and said, I must see icebergs. So we flew him to Portland, Maine, and we got in a little Geo Metro, and it was mid-May, and we drove up to northern Newfoundland, where it was, of course, still snowing, and we spent 2 weeks hanging out with icebergs, caribou, and moose. Though primarily moose and caribou were the two larger mammals that we get to spend time with, and a lot of time with icebergs, and we camped in the snow because it was snowing. And on the way up, Nanao had been invited to Halifax to Chogyam Trungpa's Tibetan Buddhist center there, and he and Allen Ginsberg gave a reading to like 2,000. There was a big red hat ceremony. I can't remember what the ceremony. There's a big, huge ceremony, and Nanao and Allen read. And when we got to Newfoundland, Nanao was thinking, and he said, "Oh, why do Americans want to be Tibetan Buddhists?" He he said, they smoke too much, they drink too much, and they don't care about the earth. Why do they want to be Tibetan Buddhists? So we thought about this for a couple of weeks while we hung out with caribou and icebergs, and we decided that the real teachers are the migratory, non-human teachers, and icebergs are migratory. I mean, we weren't just thinking of large mammals. We were thinking about everything moving, everything. I mean, you see behind me the Northern Lights. Everything's moving. I am an intergalactic being. We all are. Where are we? We're situated somewhere in the universe. So that was the beginnings of of a semi-serious movement called Caribudism, which was brought, of course, by Karibudi Dharma on the back of a reindeer to the northern hemisphere, and we started, just really bouncing back and forth the idea of what is sentience and what is sentient and what isn't sentient is there anything that isn't sentient? And what can we learn from? And that if you really wanted to live on this planet, you needed to learn from everything that the planet presents you with around you. So you needed to learn from everything from the stone to the sky and all the beings within that, and not excluding humans. I ended up doing a lot of work, and I was the opposite of the gifted and talented guy for the Arts Commission. I wanted to go to the ungifted, untalented groups, um, which was a misnomer, of course. So I ended up doing a lot of stuff with the disability community and the homeless community and refugees and immigrants and prisoners, and doing a lot of the writing projects that I did were not about my writing. They were about encouraging people who had stories that weren't being told and weren't being heard. Um, so not only was I interested in the four-legged teachers, but I was really interested in humans as teachers, but not necessarily with PhDs. You know, I mean, I learned an awful lot. I was artist in residence at Preble Street in Portland at the homeless shelter for 2 years, and I learned an awful lot listening to those folks and encouraging them to tell their stories and to feel that their stories had merit and had weight. And so that, you know, we felt that Kara Buddhism was about having a wide range of teachers, recognizing a wide range of sentience, and then practicing compassion for all beings, you know? So I had compassion for my homeless brothers and sisters, but I also worried about what was happening to certain types of trees and to the fish and to, you know, to the soil itself. Just lots and lots and lots to think about and to learn about, which tied in with back when I lived at Gary Snyder's. The big thing in 1973 and 74 was the idea of bioregionalism and defining where you live not by imposed national boundaries, but by watersheds and mountains and language groups and indigenous peoples and what trees were there and what plants were there and that kind of thing. And in order to make those kind of boundaries, you have to learn that stuff. You have to know who those guys are. Who's this plant? Is this an invasive, or is this a native? Is this someone the bees would like? Yeah, you know, who do we encourage to make the bees happy? You know, that kind of thing. And that's a forever challenge. Wherever you are, that you can never learn enough. I mean, we carried that to trying to learn from our microbes. You know, that we are the bioregion for a lot of really tiny critters who can't make it outside of our skin. And we mistreat them a lot too. We pour poisons on them too. So, you know, it was just, and now it just led me into this huge practice. And when he was getting older, one of the reasons I have the Northern Lights behind me now, he was starting to get Alzheimer's, and he had been a Zen Buddhist all his life. And I asked him how he felt about Alzheimer's. And he said, "I love Alzheimer's. No need to remember now." And he found a way to find that his Alzheimer's was his practice. He was living in the moment. And he said that he wanted to hike the Milky Way. So in order to do that, he had to drop his human body. So I can go out in the sky and look up and say, geez, I wonder where he is, you know, where is he right now? And which part of the universe is he in? So I just learned a lot from him, from Nanao, and from Gary Snyder. But then I learned a lot from all the people I've done workshops with, because I don't try to teach them very much. I try to encourage them to teach me about their lives so that I can understand the lives of other humans. And you know, I think that the way I learn about compassion is by listening with my heart to other people and other critters tell their stories. So there's a long answer to whatever the question was. Was there a question? I was introducing Kara Buddhism, and
You were.
yeah. So that's what I did. Yeah. So that's you know, and Nanao has now left the earth, and some of us are still here. Mr. Snyder is still here. He's 91 years old. He's still doing it. There's a new YouTube video of him reading poetry at age 91. I mean, you know, he's still a mentor, but he led me to all these other wonderful mentors. And you know, in Maine in 1968, 69, we didn't know much about the outside world. It was not a very diverse place, and we didn't hear a lot of the stories that hit me, you know, going from little tiny town in coastal Maine, where my dad was the police chief, with a name like Lawless, and ending up at Snyder's house in the early 70s, where all these amazing people were coming through, and the house had a Zendo, and we were part of the San Francisco Zen Center. And Baker Roshi was spending time up there, and Alan Watts came up, and Philip Whalen came out. A lot of people were leading Dharma talks on Saturdays, and it was pretty. I mean, I was just this dumb kid from Maine, and I'm sitting with all these people whose books I've read. You know, it's a little daunting, but there was that Suzuki Roshi idea of beginner mind, and I definitely had. I wasn't even a beginner. I was some step before beginner mind. So that may have worked okay. And then the now showed up and assessed the situation, because I was pretty uncomfortable. I was half as old as most of the people around me and didn't really have the life experience and context that they had. And the now showed up one day and kind of looked around, and he looked at me and he said, "Gary Schneider, too tight, and took me for a 2-day walk. And we went off and wandered around. And when we came back, I was feeling better about the world. I was pretty relaxed. He just gave me a whole new model of a way to see the universe and be part of it. Yeah. What would you like to know? I'm just rambling here.
Well, I'm just thinking you seem to have a remarkable humility in this age of the Anthropocene, where it's, for most people, I think, just assumed that humans are the pinnacle and the apex. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how have you cultivated this humility that you have? Because I think it's so precious.
Oh, it's an act. Yeah, well, the work, the stuff that I've done, you can't go into the groups that I've gone into and worked with a big human ego. You have to go with a big human heart, not a big human ego. And you have to listen, and you have to respect what you're hearing, and respect the beings that it's coming from. It's like we went to Glacier to hang out with grizzlies, and you have to learn how to behave in grizzly country, right? There's a way to behave and a way not to behave. And we found that there's a way to behave around icebergs. There's a way to behave around all beings, and trying to give yourself some context. Like, I was working with a lot of people who didn't read or write, and I didn't really understand that. How would it be to be an adult and not be able to read or write? So I had them tell me about it. I had them write poems about it, and I had my homeless friends write poems about what their lives were like being homeless. But then when you're hanging out with other species, I think that there's an oral tradition among humpback whales, for example. We don't know it yet, but I think there's an oral tradition. And I think that, like, migratory species, butterflies, how do they know to get, like in Maine from my garden, the monarchs leave and they go to Mexico? How do they? I mean, there must be incredible stories about flying down the coast to Mexico. Like, I like to tell people that it's sort of a college student thing. They're going to Mexico to have sex, but it's like spring break. But like I think all these other species have, I think, some kind of sentience and a kind of way of passing on information. And now we're finding out about what's going on in the root systems of trees and the mycorrhizal world and how they're passing on information. And I don't necessarily think languages are spoken among all different beings. I think there's lots of different ways of communication. And I've done poetry workshops with deaf people where language wasn't spoken with your mouth; it was spoken with your hands and your body. And I think that other animals watch what our bodies do and learn things about that. And if we watched them and hung out with them and tried to keep our egos from interfering and just allowed them to teach us about things, we could start picking up on. But I also think, like, granite has an oral history, and my latest projects have been with stones, and I really think that there's a whole other. But that language is so slow that one human lifetime, we might not even hear a vowel. It's granite talk is really. I've been reading lately about what Maine looked like right after the glaciers receded, and it was just bare granite. different colors of granite. I mean, down around Acadia, it was pink, and then over towards the Penobscot, it was gray and whiter, but there weren't lichen yet. There was just this gray, this shining, beautiful rock. It must have been very gorgeous, I think. And then the lichen colonies came in. It just, that whole succession. And David Abram, the author and magician, told me once that lichen was the spoken language of granite. And that as you watch the lichen circle out and grow up, that it was the granite expressing its spirit. So is it about humility, or is it about listening? And maybe that dropping the ego thing, maybe, I did hang out with a bunch of folks in the San Francisco Zen Center, and we talked a lot about that. It all, the heart accumulates this stuff. Is that an answer?
Certainly is.
Well,
or it's helping us live
something.
into it's helping us live into the questions, which is equally important.
Yeah. Well, and then I own a bookstore, so I'm also a transmitter of information. My wife and I have owned a bookstore for 41 years, and we try to have books as tools and books as tools for growth. So there's a lot of stuff we don't carry and don't care, but our customers have come to know what they can find there, and have come to enjoy being surprised by some of the stuff they can find there, because it's not necessarily something they're going to read about in the weekly newspaper. In a country where the #2 bestseller this week is a book by Glenn Beck, that doesn't give you hope for the human species as an apex species, really. I don't believe that anyway. I don't think we're the apex of creation. I've been reading books by astrophysicists, and some of them are now saying that if there's intelligent life in the universe, they probably don't want to bother with us because we're just so backward and stupid that they just go by and go someplace else. Like, this is a lower form of life, these humans. They're not good to each other.
I think I also read that you have read poetry to streams and rivers.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, but when I lived out west, Snyder and Nanao and a lot of those people were still had Shinto practice, connected to their Buddhist practice, and they were, clapping and bowing to trees and plants and talking to them. And I found, why not? And maybe if you show enough respect, you'll start hearing back a little bit. Well, I think we do hear back. We just don't. We filter it out. We don't pay attention to that. I mean, and I don't think that the birds are trying to speak to me, or that the trees are trying to speak to me. I think they're having their own communications, and that you can gradually learn, somewhat of what's going on. You can watch what's going on. They tell you certain things. My apple trees tell me certain things. They're things I know about, things they need, things they'd like to be rid of. It's about listening, but not necessarily listening with your ears, right? And not getting attached to your 5 senses as the end all. If that makes sense. I think listening with the heart's more important in the long run.
Well, that's what I'm hearing woven throughout all of what you've said thus far, is a very distinct open-heartedness and a receptivity, and what we Zen folks would sort of call a not knowing, just, an openness.
Yeah.
Suzuki called a beginner mind. How'd you get there?
Geez, I don't know. Maybe I was just born in Maine. It's being born in Maine. We don't know much anyway. It's like, there was a moment when I was 17. I was run over by a car and smashed up, had fractured skull, broken legs, and spent a year not able to walk, and for the first few months not able to read. So and my parents were working. So basically, as a teenager, as a senior in high school, I just listened to music for like and it was the late 60s. So I heard some pretty good stuff, but I didn't move and I didn't go out and I didn't have much. I was pretty much by myself a lot of the time. And that's when I started really thinking I'd like to write poetry, because I was trying to find a way to maybe even talk to myself and find out what I was trying to look at what I was thinking, and write it out and then read it back and think, oh, well, that's, you could be smarter than that, but I needed some compassion from other people at that point because I couldn't do stuff for myself and I was having seizures and stuff. And I needed compassion from others, and I was kind of learning what I needed and learning that maybe I needed to be more aware of that in other people. And then gradually with the teachers that I was hearing, Snyder extends his compassion to other beings, and now extends his compassion to other beings. And I hadn't really thought that way before, but of course it made sense. And I grew up in Maine, so there's a lot of animals and fish and critters in my life too. So I didn't grow up in a big city where there was a lack of creatures. There were always a lot of creatures around. So I have had that interaction with creatures. I just hadn't paid the kind of attention that now I would rather be paying.
And in these times of ecocide, unfortunately, and everything we see around us, how do you care for your heart?
Well, I keep, how do I care for my heart? I keep trying to write poems and stay in touch with the people who I really love and hear from. And, I've got a bunch of Italian environmentalist poet, wonderful people. We took Nanau there to meet them and spent a couple weeks there. And now I have young Brazilian poets who wanted to translate Nanau. And now we've got this whole correspondence going there. And there are all these really interesting, cool people that I keep hearing from, and we send each other stuff and we kind of buoy each other up in a world that's, then I go and read I'm reading a book right now about the disappearance of or the changing of the tree line in the circumpolar north and how rapidly that's changing. And in one way it's affecting the caribou herds. But there's all this negative stuff happening. But I can't just give in to that. I don't want to live my life that way. And if I can share that somehow through a creative art form, then that's fulfilling to me, I guess. My last project was I've been an artist in residence in some cool places. So I spent a month out on Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior, and the month I was out there were 2,000 moose and 30 plus 32, 34 wolves, and maybe 100 people over a 45-mile island. So I got to hang out a lot with moose, and that was pretty wonderful everywhere. And I had a little cabin that was 2.5 miles down a path from a campground, and just hung out with moose, a lot of birds, a lot of migratory birds coming through there. Not a lot, because it was an island, island biogeography, there's a lot of species that were missing, but a lot of birds came through and a lot of butterflies came through, which was pretty cool. But mostly moose and a few wolves down at the southern end of the island. But that was a pretty cool. And then I spent time in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I was artist in residence in Sitka, Alaska for a month, and hung out with a lot of indigenous people there, Tlingits mostly. But I've the art experiences that I've had, I've sort of chosen places to go that were fulfilling to what I needed to know about, not necessarily just because they would give me a place to write. That wasn't really, I don't really want to do that. I want to learn about some specific places. So the last place I went was sort of like that. I spent a month in Venice, and I was supposed to go back last fall for 6 weeks. Beth and I had an arts foundation gave us a free apartment there to do this project about stones in Venice. So I was there for a month doing that, and then they liked the project. So they said, "Do you want to come back for 6 weeks?" But then COVID hit, so I haven't gotten back. So there's a lot of questions that I haven't yet gotten to ask in that part of the world, because there's none of the stone there. I mean, it's Venice is mud and water, and yet everything is stone. And I was trying to find out where the building stone came from, but also where the marble came from, where the sand came from, out of Murano, big glass factories. Well, where's their sand come from? And painters' pigments. I was trying to figure out where blue came from, where red came from, because Venice was a center for arts, but where did the pigments come from? It's and they didn't really. A lot of people there don't really know the stone stories of how that all gets there. It's just there, so they have it. And, a lot of the marble was stolen by the Catholics. That's pretty interesting. They overran Istanbul, the Fourth Crusade, and looted Istanbul and brought back all this stuff to Venice, including the horses on the front of St. Mark's and a lot of the marble at St. Mark's. But the stone stories, the stone has traveled from all over the place, which is pretty cool. And nobody really asks where it's from. You go in, there's this beautiful red marble. Where's that from? Well, it's African. It's from Namibia. It's the whole world is moving. Stone is migratory. And it is. If tectonic plates, stone is moving. Everything is moving. So it gives me that fluidity. And and again, you think that, well, humans, we're fluid. Fluidity is not a new idea for humans. I mean, it's being applied these days to gender fluidity. Well, of course, we're all fluid. We're not even. You look at subatomic particles. There's stuff going through us all the time. We're not even solid. So there's so much to learn, and I don't have much time left. So I don't think I'm going to learn it all, but that's okay. It's that's sort of my practice, is trying to learn about how the world moves and how we move in it, and how better to move in it, rather how much less harmful can we be. We could behave better. Humans could behave a lot better. And that was kind of the bioregional idea, was how to pick a place and live there and become less and less and less disruptive to that place and less damaging to that place. And that wasn't just about the rock. That includes the plants and the animals and the indigenous peoples and the language cultures and all of that. The damage is in all sorts of different ways. There's that new film, The Bounty. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's a 9-minute film of a Penobscot woman and her kids, indigenous women, and they go down to Massachusetts to the legislature hall, and they read out loud the bounty bill that the Massachusetts legislature drew up to put a bounty on the head of every Penobscot and Passamaquoddy indigenous person. And then if you killed one and brought in a scalp, you got money. And they go and they just read the bill, and then they read the list of Mainers and Massachusetts people who collected on the bill. And it turns out that a number of them have towns named after them now in Maine and Massachusetts. These good citizens. And it's just a 9-minute, it's a pretty straightforward thing. You read a law and then read a list. But when you think about what they just said and how we behaved, and now, of course, that would be called critical race theory, and it would be banned from schools, because we don't want to criticize white male control. And I'm an old white man, Peter. I don't know about you, but I'm an old white man, and it's not good. I didn't want to grow up to be an old white man. Darn it! Here we are.
I haven't found an alternative yet. If I had an alternative,
well, there are
eventually,
surgical
right?
alternatives.
Eventually, I'll be microbes or something.
Yeah. Well, we'll just move on and become something else. Yeah. Well, you are microbes already, Peter. You're hosting a lot of critters.
Huge, right?
You're hosting a lot of critters.
It's a huge percentage, right? It's huge.
It's a huge, the DNA, if you look at the DNA, it's a huge percentage of DNA in your body that's not you. And then you dump, maybe you, not you necessarily, but we dump antibiotics in, and we dump all this stuff in that's bad to them. Just when there's too much bad news. I should stop sharing it here. It's just,
Well,
but
I
then
think, but that's a critical point. I mean, Aaron's question went to that, and I think it's something that we're all wrestling with at this moment. How to live, how to embrace life, how to, love our relations in the natural world and in the human world. And yet
that is the natural world, the human world and the natural world.
well,
Aren't they both the world? What's the unnatural world?
well, I could be explicit, but I won't.
Yeah.
The humans behaving unnaturally. How's that? Is that a better way to say it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But
You
anyway,
know, there are species that do horrible things to each other,
Yeah, they do. And we do. I guess, but
try being a male praying mantis and see how that works out for you. She's gonna eat you. So,
that's yeah, I'm gonna skip that life.
yeah.
But how do we keep our integrity and stay connected and stay awake? And as I hear you talking, Gary, to me, you're a scientist in the tradition of Thoreau, in the tradition of Darwin, in the tradition of Rachel Carson, of people who observe carefully. That's a form of intimacy. It's I'm not talking about double-blind experiments here. I'm talking about people who are intimate observers of the world, and it seems to me that you are one of those.
Well, and it gets called citizen science, and if you decide to become a citizen of the universe, then it's citizen science to observe that universe and the behavior of the universe. I'm a citizen scientist. Sure, I want to know how it all comes together and how I can strengthen that connection rather than, tear it apart. Yeah. Well, and you went to the Chick-Chalks and you went to Caribou Homelands, right? Wasn't that you that did that?
That was me. That was me.
Yeah. And how did you feel when you were in sacred caribou land? I mean, could you tell it was their land and not yours?
Yes, especially because that particular herd of caribou live atop the mountain, and the only way you can go and see them is to climb the mountain, and so there's really a journey, a ritual involved in even getting to where they are, and one of the experiences I had going up was, part of the trip you have to ride on a bus, and a Quebec naturalist talks on the way up and prepares people how to behave. And what he's talking about is the presence of the caribou, how to behave in the presence of the caribou. And that was profound. I had such a profound experience of the presence of the caribou that, something I can't capture in words, but they had it.
Yeah.
And when you were there, it was palpable. It was deeply significant.
But that's, we don't, in Maine, we don't know, most of us don't know how to behave when we see homeless people on the street, or we don't know how to behave among folks with disabilities, or people of different, racial, religious, ethnic backgrounds. I worked in the early 90s with a group of Somali mothers and grandmothers, and I kept misbehaving because I didn't know. First night I worked with them, I brought all this food. Well, they wouldn't eat with me in the room, and then I was supposedly there to do poetry with them, but they wouldn't share their poetry with men who weren't their father or their husband. So I kept committing these, I kept screwing up. And they knew I was there because I wanted to do something good with them. So they kept sort of, it was okay, Gary. But you have to learn to behave. And I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how best to be, how not to break that community, how not to mess up that sense of community. And it's true with homeless folks, it's true with my friends with disabilities. Like, whatever disability they have, people talk to them louder and slower for some reason. If their legs aren't working right and someone tries to speak to them, are you okay? Well, yeah, my leg doesn't. Yeah, it's there's this sense of, we just don't know how to behave with each other. We're foreign and strange with each other. And, you know, and we've become so insular. I think, you know, as humans, we've become less and less and less part of a human group, and you know, and more, and people do that, I think, to gain power and gain advantage. They find ways to separate us, you know, and race and religion and language and all these things that supposedly you know, mark us apart from other people. And I want to learn all those things. You know, I'll never learn all the languages I'd like to learn, for example, and go to all the places where they're spoken. Now I can't go anywhere. You know, it's like, because the viral community has decided they're tired of humans. You know, so, oh boy, you know, there's a community you don't want to mess with. They're really good at what they do. You know, and you know, you and watch them. They're changing, right? You know, they're changing in front of our eyes, and really fast. How you know, how fast did Omicron go from one report in South Africa to the whole world? You know, gee, those guys were pretty. But then I have people coming in the bookstore and they want to go on the paleo diet, and I, you know, I just have to say to them, do you know what the lifespan was in the Paleolithic? Do you really want to live to be 28 or 29? You know, it's just there. Maybe we should call that something else, but not a sense of human history. Beth and I, when we got married, we went to France and went into the caves and looked at the painted expression of the human unconscious on the walls of the caves. And 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, these folks were so observant of the other creatures living in their world. And there aren't very many humans depicted in those caves, but there are beautiful, beautiful, beautiful animals depicted. And we went into one cave where there were these bison, and there were straight lines on their bodies and in the air near their bodies, painted. And the guide said that the French archaeologists had said that this is obviously a hunting scene, and those are arrows and spears. But then they brought a group of Australian Aboriginal artists into the caves to get their interpretations. And they said, no, that's not what's going on. That's the animal's power coming off the animal. Just completely reverse the way you looked at that image. You know, oh, that's the animal expressing power. It's not a hunting scene with arrows coming in. It's just, you know, and so the guide said, who do you think was closer to the thinking of the people who painted those caves, the Australian Aboriginal artists or the French PhD archaeologists? You know, who was closer to those animals and to that spirit of living with those animals? You know? So there's so much to learn from it. You know, our teachers can be 30,000 years old. Our teachers can be, you know, much older than that. Granite's a good teacher, and granite's pretty old, you know, but it used to be liquid. It used to be liquid. It was moving at one point. Now you're sorry you invited me, aren't you? What is he talking about?
We have the power. We can edit all this crap
That's
out.
true. You can make me say all sorts of bad stuff.
That's right. No, when you were saying that, I was thinking about Dogen and the Blue Mountains walking. You know,
Constantly walking.
Constantly.
They
walking.
are. Yeah. They're constantly walking. Yeah. And are they blue?
Well, the ones that aren't green or yellow or brown, or who knows?
What makes them blue? What makes them blue? How did he get that sense of blue? You know, in Venice, we were like, where does the cobalt come from that turns that glass blue? You know, where do you get the cobalt? And the blue pigment that was the most expensive pigment in Venice was a ground up lapis lazuli that came across the Silk Route from a certain set of mountains in eastern Afghanistan that's now controlled by the Taliban. You know, so the Taliban controls some of the best lapis in the world. The Burmese army in Myanmar controls pretty much the best amber with the best insect inclusions. The Chinese have been studying them studying the DNA of the insects there, and now they're cut off because the army in Myanmar, the cobalt, where's that? That's in like Congo. Who's controlling that? You know, there's just, it's when you start looking into those stone sources of things, they're financing a lot of bad regimes, bad human regimes. That's a whole other story, but you know, it's all of those things I want to learn about and keep in my head and know about how they're moving around the world. But yet here I am in Maine, and it's going to be snowing. It's pretty nice.
Could be
So
worse places.
Erin was going to ask me about Henry Beston, she said. So
I was going to ask you about Henry Beston. There's a little bit of synchronicity here, Gary, because I am down here on Hatteras Island, where there's the world's sweetest little independent bookstore. I love it. And I've learned from this bookstore, Buxton Village Books, if anyone's down on Hatteras Island, that bookstores can be really subversive places in terms of what they carry. And so I'm in this bookstore, this is maybe a decade ago, and I see this quote by Henry Beston on the wall, and I'd never heard of Henry Beston at the time. And I'm asking Gary, because now Gary happens to be Gary owns an independent bookstore and is living in Henry Beston's house. And so here's the quote that really stopped me in my tracks and made me go read Outermost House. And
it's
really,
about animals. Is it about animals?
Of course it is.
Animal Kingdom. Yeah, what's the quote?
We patronize the animals for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly, for the animals shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they are more finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, but they are other nations caught with ourselves in the net of life and time.
Yeah. You go, Henry.
You go, Henry. And so I wonder if
yeah.
it's not an accident that you, someone of your unusual nature, is now living in Henry Beston's house.
Well, it's not an accident in a lot of ways. Henry's daughter was a wonderful poet. She was Maine's first poet laureate. And she started coming into Beth and my bookstore, and we knew her lineage. Her mother, Elizabeth Coatsworth, Henry's wife, published about 125, maybe 127 books herself, won the Newbery Award, won the Yale Younger Poets, won the Borzoi Prize. I mean, she was pretty amazing. And when Henry passed away in 1968, and then his wife lived until 1986, here at the farm. And then when she passed away, their daughter Kate had 6 horses here at the farm and a farmhouse full of all their books and their stuff. And she wanted someone who would move right in to take care of the horses and all the stuff in the house and not be worried that the house was already full of stuff and that the horses pooped a lot. So we moved in 1986, and we're still here. And we just Kate became our best friend, and we talked every day. And she lived all by herself on a farm on top of a hill with a big horse and a big dog. And she liked to call her friends on the phone and talk about poetry at various hours of the day and night. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful relationship. And we were already fans of both of her parents. So here we are still at the farm. Surrounded by the spirit. Henry died here and is buried here. Elizabeth died here and is buried here. Their daughter Kate died not here, but is buried here. And Beth was with her when she passed away. And a lot of their books are still here in the house. And you know, so we're kind of haunted. But you know, Henry volunteered to be an ambulance driver in the First World War, and he spoke fluent French, so they put him right in the front lines, hauling away mangled young men primarily for a year. And that horror just deeply, deeply affected him. And when he came back to this country, what did he do? He went out to the very end of Cape Cod and lived in a dune shack by himself and investigated the marvels of the natural world and just sort of healed himself by being in the pleasant presence of the natural world. You know, so how can we not? And then he wrote, you know, and they were good friends with Rachel Carson. They were good friends with a lot of the nature writers of the time. And we had a big herb garden here and did a lot of stuff with plants. And you know, he's sort of overlooked these days. Now, most of his books are out of print, but yeah, that quote. I mean, he's right. Of course, he's right. But he knew that, and he felt it, and he felt it throughout his life. That, you know, and that way of speaking about the animals is that's probably his most. You know, we get a lot of requests for reprint, and that quote is probably the most requested because it's just spot on. It just goes right to the heart. It is, yeah, and you know, and he's, you know, we think this, oh, we're wrong. You know, we're wrong. We're wrong. Yeah, yeah. It's there. They don't need us. They don't want us.
They're not below us.
They're not below us. They'd be better off without us. Yeah, yeah. I love that. Yeah.
So
Boy,
I
that's-
like to ask
Go ahead.
if somebody's listening or watching this and they're very intrigued by what you're saying, but they're stressed out, they're working, they're taking care of their family, but they're intrigued by all these qualities you're describing and embodying, Gary, what are some steps that you could suggest somebody take to start to learn how to listen to granite or hear what their butterflies are saying, or just to be more connected in the ways that you've
Well,
described?
that's just sort of basic mindfulness practice. Just at every moment, be aware. Yeah, I mean, we filter out so much of what's happening, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're smelling. So there's that, you know, just be in your body in the moment and start, but also seek out some difference. You know, go to places where you haven't been. Go to places where there are species you don't know about and try to learn about them, and encounter humans that you have been nervous about encountering. You know, and you know, Maine right now is having a big influx of refugee folks. Like right now, there has been a big influx of folks from the Congo and from places, you know, in Central Africa, and now all of a sudden there are people from Afghanistan showing up who need basic support, in part because of the brutality of the human species, and in part because of climate change. You know, and so there are the opportunities to learn about things. You know, are really cool. I think right now there are all these wonderful people from different parts of the world who appreciate, you know, they'll appreciate some basic human support and conversation. You know, you might have to learn to speak a little Portuguese, or you know, or something like that. Folks in the Congo, a lot of them speak Portuguese. But you know, your life doesn't have to be as limiting as you think it is. I think your life is as limited as you let it be, and you know that we are kind of limited right now because we can't. I feel limited because I can't just go to Italy or go to Greece. I'd like to do that, or go to Turkey. There's places, or Armenia. There's places I'd like to go right now, and I don't feel safe and comfortable about that because of my viral friends who are heavily populating some of those places and having a great time. You know, but I just think that every moment has its magic. And you know, and you can't let it oppress you. You have to find that, you know, work your heart and find that magic, but don't just work your heart. You know, allow other hearts to communicate with you. I mean, that's when I'm reading about all the trees now and learning about what's going on under the ground. They are not by themselves, you know, and all this stuff is happening. I used to lead walks a couple of years ago in a preserve in Topsom, and we would walk, and they were called creative walks, and we had a photographer and a painter and me, and we were just talking about how would you express this, you know, look at that, how would you express that, and would you choose words or photo images? And I suggested they all read Gathering Moss by Robin Kimmerer for the next walk, which got them all thinking about moss and lichen. So the next walk was the slowest walk I'd ever led because everybody's looking down. They did not want to step on moss. They were looking at moss and lichens, and instead of looking up at the trees and the birds and stuff, they were very worried about disturbing plant communities, you know, and their idea of what a community was, what a plant community. Robin Kimmerer changes your idea of what it means to be a plant community. that this is a community in conversation with its, there's all this stuff going on, and we're just, I mean, a lichen is not even one thing. It's a multiple of things at once. So it's just that attention, the little shifts of attention. When I learned about my friends who couldn't read or write, I was like, a lot of them live by themselves, in not by themselves, but they in group housing, and they would, how do you cook for yourself if you can't read? You can't read the directions. So then you go out to eat, but you can't read the menu. How do you choose what you eat when you go to the restaurant? Do you always eat the same thing? Do you watch what other people eat? How do you just negotiate simple stuff we take for granted, And I had a couple of them write poems about that just blew me away and really informed me about how they pulled that off. How do you live as an adult who's unable to read? And sort of the diminishment that brings on you. You feel less than, because you don't have that. Anyhow, I just think from moment to moment, there's something miraculous happening every moment. Whether you're picking up on it or not is a whole other thing. And my friend now, he spent every moment being enlightened by whatever was happening. And I use enlightened I mean, he was letting the light in for sure. Because I think the idea of the Western Enlightenment, not such a good thing. Pretty Western, pretty European. Not the Buddhist Enlightenment, but that whole, the artistic, Western Enlightenment. Oh, well, the Arabs had all that philosophy and all that knowledge. They were keeping it for us until we came out of the Dark Ages and caught back up, But I'm being enlightened. I have Northern Lights in back of me, so it's really coming out of my head, actually.
Well, Gary, you have brought us some magic, and you brought us some light, and your being and your presence here tonight was really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And so
Thanks.
I want to thank you for that tremendously. Erin, anything you'd want to share with Gary as we?
No, just huge thanks for sharing part of your remarkable life with us and anybody who's listening or watching. And there's so much inspiration here. So deep bow of gratitude.
Yeah. And if you find a way out of this old white male thing, keep me in mind. Let me know.
It's Caribou Darshan. Caribou Darshan is the way out of this, I think. Yeah.
So how can people find you, Gary? Did you say you had a new book coming out, or what should people know?
I have a new book that just came out in November from a press in Portland, Maine, called How the Stones Came to Venice, from Littoral Books. I also just happen to own a bookstore with my wife, Gulf of Maine Books in Brunswick, Maine. So people can always contact us there if they want to get a hold of it. Yeah, that's and then I have my two previous books, as Peter probably knows, are one is called Cariboutism, and then the follow-up to that is called Caribou Planet. So you can see where those two are going. But the new one is more about stone. Is really it's Italy, Greece, Turkey, then Barrie, Vermont, and back to Casco Bay and Penobscot Bay here in Maine. So it travels around following the stone and the stoneworkers. It follows Italian stoneworkers to Barrie, Vermont. So the Italian anarchist stoneworkers who came over to Barrie and changed stuff up there. So it's that's what I'm kind of interested in right now. They got stone out on Hatteras. There's Hatteras. There's a stone there. Peter, thank you too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's been a lot of fun, and we appreciate it. And be well. Keep on learning.
Yeah, we should all think that way. Yeah.
All right.